Title Professor Ball's lecture is Knowledge, Property and Future of Economies. Professor Ball, please start.
Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for your interest in my work. And of course, thank you for this very honored prize which I've been given, which I will cherish. And I want to thank also to the Japan Society of Political Economy for what it's done over the past almost half century to promote economics, not only in Japan but throughout the world. I have a rather difficult task because I've taken for myself an impossibly broad title to talk with you, but I thought, not knowing your interest, I would like to speak about something rather general in economics. Let me begin with two of my favorite economists. I think many of you will have read this passage from Marx. At a certain stage in their development, the material forces of production come into conflict with the property relations within which they have been at work before. From forms of development of forces of production, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins the period of social revolution. A passage probably in just a couple of phrases, summarizing as best as you can the idea of historical materialism. Here is Kenneth Arrow talking about the modern economy. Information is a fugitive resource. A fugitive is something which runs away. Information is a fugitive resource. We are just beginning to face the contradictions between systems of private property and of information acquisition and dissemination. And he goes on, Arrow, this is continuing, an increasing tension. We will see an increasing tension between legal relations and fundamental economic determinants. Now, I think you don't have to be a PhD in economics to notice a similarity between those two statements. Arrow is essentially paraphrasing Marx and applying Marx to the modern information economy. He's doing that quite knowingly. Of course, I asked him. And Arrow is, of course, very well versed in Marx. He's read Marx very carefully, and he knew exactly what he was doing. So if both of them are correct, both Marx and Arrow are correct, then it's useful for us as economists to think about how do we do economics in the future. And that's what my talk will be about. Well, one of the problems I'd like to pose to you is the following. Abel Lerner, himself a great neoclassical economist, correctly identified what was special about the neoclassical paradigm and why it had been such a big success. An economic transaction is a solved political problem. Economics has gained the title Queen of the Social Sciences by choosing solved political problems as its domain. Far more interesting than the definition of economics by Robbins about the pursuit of given ends by the use of scarce resources. I think he correctly identifies what it is about the neoclassical paradigm that makes it really powerful. What it makes it, its success was bound up with this idea that contracts were complete. He explains the transaction has a political dimension, of course, conflict between the two sides, but that is resolved in a contract. And the solved political problem is the contract itself. How it's solved is the state will intervene to enforce the contract. So the parties to the contract don't have any political relationship amongst themselves. If there's a violation of the contract or a conflict over it, it will be resolved by a third party, namely the state. So we have to ask ourselves, if this is what economics as we know it today is, then how does economics deal with the problems which we face? For example, is climate change and other environmental impacts, is that an example of an arena in which we have solved political problems? Are we just arguing about contracts, or are there things outside the contract? What about the spread of epidemic disease and the rise of superbugs? Is this an area in which we can essentially regulate our affairs by contract? Have we organized ways of, for example, making sure that people use in a responsible way the drugs they have been given? or they interact with each other in ways that don't spread diseases. Or let's think about what I will talk about mostly now, which is what I call, following Danny Qua, the weightless economy. Knowledge generation, knowledge distribution, the care of others, providing complements for leisure. This is called weightless because, unlike grain and steel, you can't weigh it. The things that are being transmitted are things which are difficult to identify and measure. And that will be important because the very weightlessness of this economy makes it almost impossible to write contracts in the important things which make up the economy itself. Now, if you look here at these things, you'll recognize these as very important economic problems. Or very important social problems. There's no doubt that these are important, and I think equally in your mind, there is also no doubt that these things are not covered by complete contracts. And so we have to ask, has the Queen's reign, has the Queen's domain gotten smaller? Should economics take a more modest position and say that, well, we're basically okay for shopping, and we maybe have something to say about a few parts of economic life, but of the big questions facing the world today, economics should retreat because the Queen no longer has a very large role to play. The things which we really care about in the world today lie outside the boundaries of economics. Well, if I'm going to answer this question, we might want to say, how did the Queen, that is economics, get to have such a big domain in the first place? Why were we so successful in establishing that our science would be the science of society instead of the other sciences, and indeed other fields entirely, such as history? Now, I think it goes back a long way, but one could start with Smith. Of course, this is a passage almost as famous as Marx's passage from Adam Smith. He intends only his gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. And he goes on in a familiar way. You know also, of course, that Smith was very aware of the extent to which people's pursuit of self-interest could take nefarious or antisocial forms. This is less quoted, but I'm sure it's familiar to you. People in the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment or diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So self-interest itself was not going to solve the problem. Self-interest would solve it only under a set of circumstances which Smith then went on to identify. And of course, this gets us eventually, over a long period of time, to the invisible hand. The solution, according to Smith, was market competition plus well-defined property rights, covering everything that mattered in a transaction, would empower the invisible hand to defeat the conspiracy against the public, because free entry would defeat the conspiracy, and then the competition with complete contracts or complete markets would lead to a Pareto-efficient competitive equilibrium. And so we waited many years, but finally were able to determine exactly what was required, thanks to Arrow, DeGroote, McKinsey, and others. And they are quite clearly complete markets. I use that to mean the same thing as complete contracts. Everything that matters is part of a contract, which is enforceable at no cost. And returns to scale are absent or at least limited. Now, it's well known, I think, to every first-year student that under these conditions, we will have the price will be equal to marginal cost. And because of complete contracts, marginal cost will be equal to social marginal cost. And this is the key thing which is driving the invisible hand. The equation of marginal cost, social marginal cost to marginal cost and to price. I mention this because, of course, this will become quite a problem as we turn to the information economy. Now, what I want to say is that these assumptions here were never very close to the truth. But they approximated in some way the economies of the past, at least in a way that it no longer approximates the economy in which we now live. So let's think about Were these assumptions ever a good guide to economic policy making? Well, yes. In an economy made up of grain and steel, those assumptions were not so bad. Of course, there were problems of lack of competition in the steel industry, and there are other problems in grain, but in the economy of things which could be weighed, the assumptions on which the fundamental theorem works are not so obviously wrong as they are today. Most outputs and inputs, with the exception, of course, of labor itself, could be measured, weighed, fenced, delimited in some way. They could be written in contracts, and their exchange and their production could be governed by complete contracts. Now, and you have all of these images here are simply giving you examples of what it means to have a Walrasian economy. It's an economy in which we have homogeneous goods, and they're easily measured, and there's no contest about the measurement of them. And if, for example, I buy some beans from this guy and I take home the bag and there are no beans inside, well, I can easily get my money back. That's the idea of the complete contracting. Now, I think, of course, when I was a grad student in economics, there was a lot of discussion about the cost of monopoly. Edward Chamberlain was my teacher, so I learned a lot about monopolistic and imperfect competition. But I think it's fair to say that particularly with the global integration of national economies, economies today are quite competitive. There are some industries in which this is not true, but the lack of competitiveness among firms is not high on my list of what is wrong with capitalism. It's actually quite a competitive environment. Of course, the economy did not correspond to the assumptions of the fundamental theorem, but as I say, it came much closer than what was to come. And this is the weightless economy. Think about the weightless economy and think about this basic phenomenon that you all know about, which is we have first copy costs, the cost of writing the book or producing a book, and the cost of then distributing it. Essentially zero marginal costs for many things or extremely low, very high first copy costs. I can give you plenty of examples. I happen to know what Windows 97 cost. I don't know what later versions cost. It cost a large sum of money, 50 million or something. The second copy cost about $3. And of course, for many people, it cost exactly zero because it was easily stolen. There are all kinds of other things in which you have essentially software being produced. There's no product. There's no physical thing being distributed. Some of the best examples have to do with generic pharmaceuticals and drugs, in which these are hard statistics to investigate very confidently. But in many of these areas, the generic drugs, that is the non-trademark drugs, sell for 1/10 of what the trademark drugs sell for. And we understand, of course, that the generic drug makers are making profits selling them at that low price. So we have no idea what the marginal costs of these things are, but probably it's exceedingly low. Let's think about contracts. Because copying costs are low, enforcing ownership of goods is difficult. But that's not the worst problem. The worst problem is if you do enforce property rights in the goods, it results in a massive inefficiency because, of course, if the good has a zero marginal cost, it should be distributed for roughly zero. The enforcement of intellectual property rights drives not a small wedge, but a gigantic difference between the price at which the good is sold and its marginal cost. So when you think about the problem of enforcement of intellectual property rights, I think we should think of the intellectual property rights thief. The one who steals the intellectual property rights is the one who's trying to implement the fundamental theorem by distributing goods at zero marginal cost. Of course, they are chased by all kinds of people trying to enforce the property rights, but in doing so, they are forcing a violation of the fundamental assumptions on which neoclassical economics has demonstrated falsely, of course, the superiority of the system which it advocates. Let's think about the question of economies of scale. We have, of course, a phenomenon of network externalities. They were rather unimportant initially, so I chose an old example of the fax. Fax technology has been around forever, and faxes did not exist. It was easily done, but they all of a sudden became a big thing in the 80s when a business couldn't be in business without a fax. In the 70s, nobody had one. These are what we call demand-side increasing returns to scale. They complement supply-side increasing returns with which everyone is familiar. Now, to take fax, no one has a fax now. Probably people, you know, if students wouldn't know probably what a fax was. So we have to talk about two-sided markets like Airbnb or Tinder. Tinder is how you get dates. If anybody here is looking for a date, you just go to Tinder and you'll find a very nice person to have dinner with. The problem with these two-sided markets, of course, is just as we have network externalities, and therefore we have the chicken and egg problem. There's no demand without supply, and there's no supply without demand. And the obvious market failure is, presumably, there are very large numbers of these two-sided markets which should exist, but don't exist without public support because there's no way to get them started. Let's think about market structure. The market structure of the grain and steel economy exhibited a combination of competition and stable oligopoly. That was, of course, undermined by globalization, as you had more and more firms, for example, selling automobiles and steel and so on. The weightless economy, I think, is likely to be characterized by a serial monopoly, real monopolies like Microsoft, but which are of limited duration because of the extremely rapid pace of change. That's a conjecture, but I think it could well be true. And so we have the following dilemmas. We have increasing returns on both the demand side and the supply side. And that has two consequences. One is it's difficult to sustain competition under conditions of downward sloping average cost curve, which would never turn up. You know, somehow in the textbooks, the long run average cost curve always turns up, magically. It does that. But it's very hard to find that actually in the economy. So an economy of downward sloping long run average cost curves, of course, is an economy in which the competitive process itself is unstable. And this leads you to, of course, not only lack of competition, but to a winner-take-all dynamic, which is likely to give rise to very substantial levels of inequality. Now, it also means that it's impossible for firms to set a price equal to marginal cost, for the simple reason that the marginal cost is below the average cost, and therefore any firm which conformed to the rule required by the fundamental theorem, any firm doing that would be an X firm, that is a failed firm. Then we move on and we find out that, of course, property rights are both ambiguous, as we know from all the legal litigation over intellectual property rights, and difficult to enforce. And I've already said, enforcing them is, of course, a very heavy cost to bear, because it requires that goods be sold at prices considerably above their marginal cost. This is a very serious set of problems. This is a set of problems that you get to if you take seriously what Arrow said at the beginning. Arrow's remarks lead us to sort of make this list. Now, I would like to, so I go back to find other economies which have been, about which we know. And I've studied at great length ancestral economies of the distant past. So I'd like to tell you a long-term perspective. There was a time when humans lived in small groups. They were hunters and gatherers. They lived on wild species. They didn't cultivate plants, and they didn't tend animals. But eventually there was a property rights revolution. I call it the first property rights revolution, which introduced private property in the things which the farmers then farmed, such as livestock and land and stores. And eventually, as predicted, the establishment of rights of property, of private property, and competition among these producers, eventually, with the advent of capitalism, led to what Adam Smith called the wealth of nations. And now we come to the present. Just as the rise of agriculture facilitated the unambiguous individual ownership of fields and livestock and crops. And that displaced the shared ownership and collective decision-making of our distant ancestors, the hunters and gatherers. Today, the rise of the information economy, the weightless economy, has reversed the process. And I want you to think about this. We are actually today reversing a process which took place 10,000 years ago, in which we made a transition from an economy in which it was almost impossible to define private property to an economy in which it became quite simple to, because we were farmers and later industrialists and so on. Today we're moving into an economy in which information, ideas, computer applications, and so on are like the antelopes and the giraffes and the other animals which we chased and killed and ate and which were the sustenance of our economy. They had the same characteristics. These, for example, it was difficult to own a wild animal before you captured it, risky to pursue, you probably wouldn't get one, and extremely wasteful if you didn't share it, because it was a huge animal, and if you didn't share it, it would just be wasted. Now what I'm saying is this: information and ideas have the same character. They're very difficult to own, and they're extremely wasteful if we don't share them, because they're actually public goods. So not sharing them would be like if I'm a hunter and I'm very lucky today and I capture a large animal, I would refuse anybody else to be able to eat the animal, and it would just rot in its place. Of course, they never did that. So let's look at technologies. This simplex here is a way of representing a technology. Well, let me point to this one here. The simplex is a representation of a technology. The coordinates of a point in the simplex sum to 1. So that, for example, this distance beta here is how important the top thing is, the embodied skills. We think of people, producers, whether workers or whatever society they're in, as having this kinds of wealth, which could be material, they could be network wealth, or they could be embodied or somatic, that is part of their bodily makeup. Some people might call network wealth and embodied wealth human capital. So we can represent a technology as being intensive in the use of certain kinds of things that humans have or own. So for example, a technology here would be one in which the only thing that mattered was material wealth, machinery and land and so on. And a point up here might mean, well, here we have a situation in which network wealth is very important. You see it's close to this vertex here. Material wealth is not very important, and neither is embodied wealth. That's just teaching you the simplex. So let's think about, and this is just for your interest, this is actually estimating technologies in different modes of production over the course of human history by a method which I won't bother you with. But I have some speculations about where we've been. If you wonder who those are guys who I hunted with. We were hunting large animals, and we didn't catch any. I'm sure if there's some these people here, there must be at least a few vegetarians here, so you should be relieved. I was very relieved. I didn't know what I would do if we encountered a large animal. I would be scared of the animal. I would be even more scared that I might hurt the animal. So let's think about the long-term history. Kenneth Arrow, remember what he said: information is a fugitive resource. We're just beginning to face the contradictions, and so on. Well, I think what Kenneth Arrow was perhaps speculating is the following. In our distant past, we were at a point like A, in which somatic, that is embodied wealth, and network and knowledge were very important. These were the kinds of wealth that mattered, and so we were at some point A on this edge of the simplex. Then, with the development of agriculture during the Neolithic period, and eventually the Industrial Revolution, we moved to a point like B, in which material wealth became very important. And that's, of course, the history of capitalism, but long before that, the rise of agrarian economies and so on. And I think that Arrow is now speculating that we're moving back to this edge of the simplex, in which knowledge and somatic skills are more important. I'm not sure that Arrow thinks that, but I know that I think that, and I would like to persuade you, if I could, that that's probably true. And that's what this is what's happening with the new, weightless economy. Now, what should we expect as the process of change in this information-based weightless economy? Well, Marx provided us with some reasoning about the forces and relations of production, as did Arrow. But it's actually a rather complex problem, because what you'll have as the system evolves is institutions changing, both because within a group individuals may adopt one kind of institution or other, but it's also true that the groups are competing with each other. And some groups will successfully compete and they'll double or triple in size, and others will fail. The problem of mathematically analyzing two selection processes, one among individuals changing their particular way of doing things, and then a competition between groups, is mathematically quite difficult. Analytical solutions are, I think, virtually impossible in realistic problems. And so I will define a little program to see if we can understand how this might happen if we have firms competing with each other with different kinds of behaviors, cooperative and self-interested and so on. So there are three types. There's a bourgeois type who insists that possessions are to be owned, and the bourgeois type will defend his or her possessions. A civic is a kind of person who shares with others, and they're also willing to punish people who don't share. So if you're a bourgeois and you meet me, and you won't share with me, then I call all of the other civics and I say, hey, this guy is not sharing, and then we punish you in some way, and probably we take your goods or something of that nature. The sharers are people who simply share, and if confronted with the bourgeois takes it. So there are three types in the population. The way the system evolves is that individuals are paired. Periodically, maybe you think it's an adolescent is paired with some teacher or some other cultural model, and the individual has to decide what behavior he or she is going to adopt. Well, if the cultural, this is the way I programmed this, and this is the model which I decided would be appropriate. If the cultural model is the same as the individual, nothing happens, they just go home. But if the two have different types, then the individual copies the type which has the highest payoff. So the individual, if the teacher has a higher payoff than the student, and then there are different cultural types, then the student becomes like the teacher. Otherwise not. Now we have, every individual is in a firm. And the firms with higher payoffs survive, and those with lower payoffs die. And their members are then distributed to other firms. The losing groups, they are absorbed by the other firms, and for some period of time, they're of course under the influence of the winners. So they're culturally assimilated by the winning types. So you have to notice what's going on here is two types of selection. The firms are dying and being born of different types, because the firms will be of mostly bourgeois or mostly civic and so on. And also individuals are changing which type they are. This is a different simplex. This is a distribution of the population. This is the population of individuals, not of firms. Over here we have a situation where everyone is a sharer. Over here everyone's a bourgeois. This point here has this amount of civics, that amount of sharers, and this amount here, this amount here of sharers, that amount of bourgeois, and this amount of civics. That's just, again, how to read the simplex. I tell you that a second time because I'm going to show you what happens when we actually do this. Now, in this space, we're trying to find a state which will be a stationary state. We're looking at history. We're saying, if you start off in society with all civics, will it survive? If you have all bourgeois, will that survive? And then I'm going to ask an interesting question. I'm going to say, suppose the nature of property rights changes. Does that change what the equilibria are? You'll see it in front of your eyes. As I say, I couldn't solve it mathematically, but it's quite dramatic when you actually look at the simulation. There is an equilibrium here with all bourgeois. As long as property rights are uncontested, that is, we have complete contracts, all bourgeois will be a solution to the problem. And also all civic will be a solution that is a stationary state. The reason why all civic is a stationary state is pretty obvious, because if everyone is a civic and there's one bourgeois, well then he or she, the bourgeois, is going to be in trouble, because every time they interact with somebody, the civic guys are going to all together punish the individual, so that person will have low payoffs and will be eliminated. So this is basically, all of these points here are equilibrium. You can be on, as long as you have no bourgeois, it'll be a stationary state. Over here it's stationary. There's some unstable points in the simplex that I won't bother with down. Now, let me go on to the actual simulation. We have 25 firms, 20 individuals each. I think we're going to now look at what happens when we change the property rights. But let's see if I can find this program and make it work. By the way, you can go to my webpage and play with this thing if you want. You'll find out things about it my co-author and I didn't know. We have a very user-friendly interface, which I think you'll like. It looks more or less like this. I'm just setting some parameters here. The key thing is the following. As you can see, ambiguity. It's hard to see it, but this, like, if you read ambiguity up at the top there, it says 0. So where it says 0 ambiguity, it means that the property rights are uncontested. So if I'm in the possession of something, you're not going to try to steal my software, in other words. So let's look at the situation and how I was playing the wrong game. The top line are the bourgeois, and these guys are the civics and sharers. This is the fraction of the population. The top up here is interesting. That's the same simplex that you saw before. Each of the red dots is a population. Let's let it go again. Nothing's going to happen here, but it's fun to watch it go. Each of those dots is a population, and you can see they're quite mobile. I mean, apparently the surface is pretty flat because they're moving around quite a bit. But notice they're stuck in the corner. That's all bourgeois. So essentially, all the firms are standard capitalist firms. Now let's change the ambiguity of the property rights a little bit. I'll set it up, and I'm moving my cursor up here where it says ambiguity. I could make the ambiguity be 20%. It's just how often somebody contests your property right. But let's make it, say, 90%. So I just have a situation now in which the property rights are very indistinct. And let's see what happens. By the way, I don't know if you've ever run these before. You probably think that I'm showing you something that I have in my computer. No. This is the only time this will ever be seen. This is a highly stochastic process. And it has lots of random number generators generating all the stochasticity. So there's no likelihood that what you're going to see is anything I have ever seen before. Occasionally you see surprises. But let's see what happens. We're going to ask now, do we get this kind of equilibrium in which we have bourgeois, all the firms are bourgeois, and all the types of individuals are bourgeois? Let's see. What's happened? You have a lot of firms now up on that edge. That's a bunch of people who are civics and sharers. These ones here, the blue line is the civics. So the population is now dominated by civics. Most of the firms have people who are sharers and punishers of those who don't share. Occasionally you'll see a little bit of deviation. I'm going to run it slower. It's not very slow. You can see essentially that what's happened is the change in the nature of property rights has brought about an institutional revolution and has eliminated the capitalist firms in favor of cooperative firms. That is, firms in which the individuals are sharing. It's actually very interesting what the dynamics are on the simplex. but I won't go into that. I'll stop this. But do go to my webpage and play with it. It's kind of addictive. If you may end up spending all night playing with it. So make sure you have a lot of coffee before you start, because it's really fun. And for a lot of people, I know a lot of people here are mostly used to, you work with theorems or you work with other ways of doing economics. This is a different way. I mean, it's a way of exploring a surface or how something works in a way which is really more like a historian, because you're trying out different hypotheses, and the difference between historians and us is if you have models like this, you can actually just run artificial histories, and that's what I call this. This is just a summary. Here we have the ambiguity of property rights, and here we have the fraction of civics and sharers. And as you can see, the fraction of civics and sharers is much greater if property rights ambiguity, that is the contestability of property rights, is substantial. The evolutionary success of the bourgeois equilibrium depends on property rights being unambiguous. It depends on the complete nature of the contract and its uncontestability. But the thing in red I want to draw your attention to is that economics as we know it, meaning what's taught in most economics programs, the queen of the social sciences also depends on exactly the same thing. It depends on contracts being complete. And so I have simulated here a revolution in social organization which could take place if contracts become incomplete. And now I want to ask all of us here, are we ready? Are we ready as economists to be good economists in the new world?